we're going to move into the last section of this chapter, which is on emotion. And emotions are going to be mental states or feelings that are associated with, specifically, our evaluation of our experiences. And so emotions can be either positive or negative. And when we talk about, they could be a feeling or an affect with an A, not an E. But if something is a particular affect, then maybe if you're in a positive affective state, then you are in a good mood. Whereas if you're in a negative affective state, you are in a bad mood. So you'll sometimes see that word thrown around, specifically when talking about emotions and internal states. And our emotions are going to end up being a pattern that interact a cognitive level and a physiological level and a behavioral level of all of our reactions. So it's a multifaceted approach. Our emotions aren't just one thing, it's going to be a combination of a bunch of different factors. And so we're going to talk through sort of what's going on emotionally and some of the most common theories that deal with emotions as well. And so since we're transitioning between the start of the chapter where we talked about motivation and now moving into emotion, then we should maybe address that there is actually a link between motivation and emotion. And so we tend to react specifically when our goals, the things that we're being motivated to achieve, are gratified or threatened or frustrated. So if we're trying to accomplish something, maybe you're learning a crazy new card trick, and you finally get it just right so that you can show your friend, then you could be gratified. You've attained your goal, and your feelings, your emotions are going to be really high and really intense. It's going to be a positive feeling. Whereas if something goes wrong, maybe you're trying to bake a cake and somebody bumped the oven and your cake didn't rise. Maybe you're going to feel frustrated or angry or something negative towards that goal not happening. And so there's lots of research that studies motivation and emotion, and some people go so far as to say you can't have emotions unless you have that sort of motivational investment in the outcome. But not everyone subscribes to that idea. And the last point we'll make is that you tend to have stronger reactions if the thing that's happening is more important. So you would be a lot happier if you, say, made the Olympic running squad versus if you, found $1 on the street. The larger the goal, the bigger the deal, the more emotionally involved you can become. And I'm sure there are examples where that doesn't quite work, but that's the trend. And so when we want to start talking about the adaptive value of emotion, we're going to start bringing in some other concepts from earlier in the course. And if we're talking about adaptations, we should start thinking evolution and natural selection, things that are adaptive for our survival. And so we can talk about the fact that emotions are going to help direct our attention. Negative emotions, something like being angry or scared, can serve to help narrow our attention. It focuses our attention. And it's also going to end up increasing our physiological activation. So if you hear a loud noise, you're going to be startled. Maybe you're going to be afraid, and you're going to funnel all of that physiological activation, that faster heart rate and your wider eyes, into trying to spot what caused that noise. You're going to direct your attention to the specific source that's caused that negative emotion. So something like our fight or flight response can serve in this capacity. And then on the other side, if we have positive emotions, maybe you're feeling happy or loved or relaxed, Feeling those emotions helps to broaden our thinking. It makes us feel comfortable enough to exhibit exploration and learning type behaviors. So positive emotions allow us to relax and explore our environments, whereas the negative ones help us focus in on things that need attention. And we can talk about, again, social communication. So an emotion, especially something that is visible to others, could be evolutionarily beneficial. So if you see someone on the street and they're smiling, then maybe that's going to make you a little bit happy, but you're not going to be worried, you're not going to be afraid of them because look, that's just a happy person walking down the street. But if you see someone and they look angry or they look aggressive, then maybe you're going to get concerned. Maybe you're going to change your behavior. Maybe you're going to walk on the other side of the street. Because you're inferring, you're making some assumptions about that person's internal state based on what you're seeing from their body language, from the expression on their face, from how they're moving, from everything about them. And as humans, and again, as social creatures, as I like to say, we tend to feed off of each other. So if you see someone who's happy, we tend to feel happy. If we see someone who's sad, we might start feeling sad. Humans have this incredible ability to show empathy, where we can empathize with others and sort of feel what they're feeling in sympathy with them. And so that can change our behavior, and our behavior can change others. It's all this feedback loop. But it helps us sort of get an idea how having these emotions and having some of these positive outcomes of having emotions could make it evolutionarily beneficial to actually have those emotions in the first place. Probably explains why they are so widespread. And so we can talk now about, well, what is making up this emotion? What's involved in our feeling and experiencing emotions? And so we're going to talk about a pattern where emotions are specifically going to be responses to eliciting stimuli. And they're going to result from a cognitive appraisal, how we evaluate that stimulus. And then our bodies will respond physiologically to that stimulus. We're going to have some kind of physical reaction. And then we're going to also have a behavioral reaction, some kind of behavioral tendency. And those tendencies can be either expressive or instrumental. And that's an overview for what we're going to spend the next couple of slides talking about. Not something that you need to know right off the bat from one walkthrough. But of course, that's going to come along with a diagram where we have our eliciting stimuli, the thing that starts everything off. And then our cognitive appraisal, what we think about that stimulus. And then we can have this interaction between our physical responses and our behavioral responses and how this all works together. And so we're going to walk through each stage step by step and get a few examples that illustrate each point. So starting at the beginning with our eliciting stimuli, these stimuli can be internal or external. You can become mad because, say, a car drove by and they splashed you with a puddle. You are mad because of that event. If you are thinking about hypothetically walking down the street and having been splashed by a puddle, then you're internally driving whatever emotions you have in response. So you can remember a time that you were angry, and you can also start feeling some anger because of that memory. So we can feel an emotion because of something that is currently happening in the environment, or something internal that either happened in the past or could happen or might happen. It can be anything driving that emotional experience. And so we're going to see this eliciting stimulus can be related to some innate biological factors. So innate meaning something that's probably genetically driven. So it's something that we're going to experience basically from birth. And we get to see some evidence for this in a couple of examples that we've talked about before. So we have newborn infants can respond emotionally. So by the time they're 3 days old, babies will tend to be able to hear another baby cry, and they respond by crying themselves. You see young children start smiling right off the bat, but what we know about how babies evolve and how their visual systems evolve, they can't really see clearly that early on. So they're probably not just imitating, they also smile just because. And more evidence with that is somebody who's been blind since birth will still smile when they're happy, even though they haven't learned to smile when happy. And we also have the fact that adults are primed to respond to evolutionarily significant stimuli, which is a fancy way of saying it's easier for adults to learn something that is biologically relevant. And we've already talked about an example of this where we mentioned that adults are easier to, it's easier to teach us to learn that a negative thing like a shock could be associated with negative stimuli like spiders or snakes. So we make that pre-assumption where those things are bad in our minds, and so we associate it with bad things. So that's a priming type example where there's this pre-existing preference to associate those things as bad. So there's lots and lots of examples of ways that we have these innate or pre-installed factors driving our emotions. But it's not always the whole picture. There are still events of learning, so previous experiences can affect how we currently experience an emotion. One of my friends, when I was growing up, she was bit by a dog when she was young. And so when she sees a dog now, she has that emotional response, that gut response to be afraid, and then she can calm herself down. But this eliciting stimulus of seeing a dog for her is now something she's learned is scary or can be scary because of past experience. And so things you've encountered can change how you're going to view them in the future. And that brings us then into this cognitive appraisal where, of course, it gets even more complicated because we're talking about how humans are internally evaluating their emotional state. So cognitive appraisal is this part here, and this is going to be our first step coming from that eliciting stimulus. And our cognitive appraisal is going to interact with all of the other steps. That's why these arrows here are double-headed. So you can think about a particular experience, you can have a physiological response, and then that physiological response can cause you to maybe reevaluate your appraisal of the situation. So there's some back and forth between all of these different areas, and that's why there's so many arrows here. But our cognitive appraisal gives us a chance to interpret and evaluate that sensory stimulus, the thing that is eliciting this response, but also allows us to interpret and evaluate how we respond to that stimulus. And so this is where we start seeing some interesting effects. So it can influence our expressions and actions, so it can cause some of our behavioral stuff to be different. It can even affect our physiological responses. And people can have different reactions to the same event. So with my example of a friend who has a fearful response when she sees dogs, if I see a dog, I'm not going to react as afraid right off the bat. I'd probably get excited that I get to pet a dog. So we can have different reactions to the same event. And we should also consider that if your experience changes, maybe you used to like a particular kind of ice cream, but now it makes you sick. So your cognitive appraisal of seeing that kind of ice cream would change. You used to get excited that you could eat it, but now you just get sad because you can't eat it anymore without getting sick. So we have these differing reactions to the same stimulus based on individual experience and personal situations and even your internal state at the moment. Maybe you're excited to see food, but then you realize that you're full, so it's less exciting. All sorts of things that can happen at this level. And again, we can bring in this effect of culture because we seem to have some cultural similarities and differences. And we'll talk just a little bit ahead of here about some of the basic emotions. And there seem to be some emotions that are evaluated very similarly across multiple cultures. So it doesn't matter what country you're in, people seem to view those emotions about the same way. But if we get into some of the more nuanced emotions, maybe the difference between adoration and admiration, maybe you start having some differences based on cultural experience. But from what we just talked about, where we're discussing sort of your interpretation, your evaluation based on personal experience and what's around you, if you're evaluating people from two different cultures, their individual experiences would be different as well. So there is an effect of culture that we're going to see because it's influencing individual experiences as well. And we'll find that culture and experience works their way into each of these sections, and we'll bring it up each time as we get there. So next we're going to talk about our physiological responses. And on this slide, I couldn't actually fit in our diagram, so I'm going to scoot back very briefly and point to our physiological responses. And then we're going to talk about them. And this is more leaning back into that biological side of things, because this is our physiological, our physical bodily response to our emotions. And a lot of our emotions seem to be an interaction between cortical and subcortical structures. So the surface of your brain versus deeper into the brain. And we're going to see a lot of involvement from the hypothalamus, the amygdala, even the hippocampus. And for these three, if we look at case studies where there's been damage or modification of these structures, or even here talking about stimulation, that's when they would apply electrical current to those areas, you can see aggressive behavior displayed because of basically messing with any of these three structures. So if destroying them or altering them can cause aggression, then these three structures must be involved somehow in our producing emotions. And then also our cerebral cortex, specifically our prefrontal cortex, seems to help regulate emotion. And again, if you've looked at some case studies, there's a case of someone who had a railway spike driven through the front of his head, and he ended up having very, very different personality with mood swings and emotional problems because he lost his ability to regulate those emotions. So that's some of the ways we can figure out what parts of the brain are involved in what. And so if we look at our diagram here, we can see sort of step one is our sensory input. And so we'd come in from our sensory neurons into our spinal cord, up into the brain, and most of it's going to route through the thalamus, though we'll look at that in more detail in a moment. But the thalamus is really important here, and it can send information either directly to our amygdala, and our amygdala is really good at figuring out emotions. It's responsible for a lot of our gut responses. So if you feel disgusted by something or if you feel scared of something, that's usually your amygdala acting. But the thalamus doesn't just feed back to the amygdala, it also sends basically a copy. It's going to send some of that information into your cerebral cortex, which is where you have all of those interconnected thinking abilities. And that's where you're going to do some more of your cognitive appraisals, where you can think about the information that's being brought in. And we'll see in just a moment that having the thalamus get the gut reaction from our amygdala, but also give us a chance to think about and evaluate that same information, we can end up with sort of two distinct ways of treating the same information that comes in. And we can look at that here as part of our dual pathway of emotion. So our thalamus is going to split that incoming sensory information and send it to the amygdala for your gut response, have that emotional and behavioral immediate reaction, or it can send it into your cerebral cortex where you can consciously think about it. You can interpret it and evaluate it. And that's why sometimes you'll have that gut response to something. Maybe you're walking along a path and you see something and your brain tells you it's a snake. You assume it's a snake and you jump back and you feel afraid, but then you stop and go, wait a second, it's not a snake, it's just a stick. So your cerebral cortex came in and thought about it and said, no, it's not the thing that you initially thought it was, it's something else now that we've considered the situation. And so you can have that gut reaction to start and then a more level-headed evaluation that follows. And so if we're going to talk just a little bit more about this amygdala, because it's so important, we care about the idea that it can process our input, that sensory input, before it gets interpreted or evaluated by our cerebral cortex. And this leads to some really cool things because it's basically a direct line to having that emotional response to stimuli. So even in cases, say with experiments in rats, they removed the visual cortex, sort of that occipital lobe, at least parts of it. They found that it didn't impair having a classically conditioned fear response in those rats. So you could remove the part of their brain that's responsible for interpreting and thinking about visual information, but the rats would still be able to show a fear response to a visual stimulus. So you can pull out that cognitive loop, that thinking aspect, but you still get that gut response because it doesn't rely on that higher ordered cognitive evaluation. And we can still, again, in humans, you can have an example of, say, somebody who's suffered brain damage that's affected their hippocampus. If that damage usually means that with their hippocampus damaged, they wouldn't be able to learn a connection between a conditioned stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus. So we couldn't use classical conditioning, but we could still give them a fear response. So normal classical conditioning doesn't work, but you can still have a classically conditioned fear response. So that tells us that fear and other emotions, strong emotional feelings, don't have to involve the rest of your cerebral cortex. It can be more on that gut instinct side of things, which is very, very cool. And in the topic of looking at parts of people's brains and how their behavior may or may not change based on what's working or not working, there have been a couple of really cool studies looking at differences in hemispheric activation. And so we talked way back when about hemispheric lateralization, the idea that one side of your brain is good at one set of tasks and the other side is good at a different set of tasks. That's the same idea here. And we end up seeing that the left hemisphere seems to be involved in positive emotions, and the right hemisphere seems to be involved in negative emotions. And they figured this out a couple of different ways, but they could use brain scans on infants to see which hemisphere is more dominant. Do they have more activation in their left hemisphere or their right hemisphere? And babies that tended to have higher activation in the right hemisphere, they would cry more quickly and they would cry for longer if their mother left the room. So they'd show more negative emotions than babies who had more activation in their left hemisphere. And you could also have artificial stimulation of one side of the brain or the other and see more positive or more negative emotions. So there's lots of evidence that says there's something going on here where left is linked with positive and right is linked with negative. But of course, it's not always clear-cut. There are some exceptions and some special cases where it doesn't quite work that way. But the trend is pretty cool to talk about, so we'll leave it there. For our next section, I'm actually going to scoot ahead one slide just because I know this diagram is here. So we're still in these physiological responses, And we can make use of the fact that a lot of our physiological responses, a lot of our gut reactions, tend to be driven maybe a little bit more by our amygdala, by that autonomic response. And so they're going to happen automatically without that cognitive involvement, at least not to the same degree. And people figured this out and decided that they were going to make use of our autonomic responses, the things that we do automatically when we feel certain emotions. And this is how they came up with the idea for polygraphs. And so this diagram here is showing someone wearing a polygraph machine, and then over here, the different markers that they can track. And so at the bottom, this is just our time indicator. So they'd use a little pulse every 2 seconds so that you know when during the interview a certain thing happened. They can look at your pulse rate. They can look at skin conductance. And we talked about this earlier in the class. And that's basically how sweaty your palms are, or your fingertips, or whatever. And the idea being that if you are asked something that is emotionally arousing, maybe it's something that makes you scared, or maybe you are lying and you're feeling worried that someone might catch you about it, your skin will conduct electricity better because you start to sweat just a little bit. The event marker here is basically they ask you question A and nothing happened, and then question B, and question B seems to correspond with this really high hike in skin conductance. So they probably told the truth at A, but they probably lied at B. And you can see the same thing here, a trend where if this is our respiration, you breathe in and out and in and out, and then we see here their breathing changed. So their breathing probably changed as that automatic response to having to tell a lie. All right, so enough about our physiological stuff. Now we're going to get into our behavioral responses. And these are expressive behaviors and instrumental behaviors. And expressive behaviors are going to be things that you express. They are observable or visible displays of emotion, something that you can see or hear. So maybe somebody smiles because they're happy, or you hear a friend's voice catch and you know that they're sad. And this is how we can infer the emotions of others. We can pick up on these emotional cues and react accordingly. And that's where we had talked before about having sympathy or empathizing with people because we can read their emotions. And this is a good category. Excuse me, words are not working today. This is possibly a good way that we could explain emotions having evolved are the benefits of our observable or expressive behaviors. And this is when we start getting into how we categorize our expressions of behaviors. And so we've discussed a lot of this information previously, so I'll go a little bit quickly here. So we have the fundamental emotional patterns. That's that idea that there are innate emotions. There are things that come hardwired for us. So we have that children who have been blind from birth will still express the same basic emotions as sighted children do. They'll still smile when they're happy and cry when they're sad. We have those things that come sort of built in. And we also have other evidence that these are probably biologically hardwired into us because we see similarities across cultures. So even though our cultural experiences are different, some emotional patterns will be the same no matter what culture you were raised in. And that gives us a leg to stand on for this evolutionary view, because some emotions can be innate, and evolution and natural selection will only act on things that are genetically influenced. And so because they are genetically innate, they can be acted on by evolution, but we also have the effect where these emotions can be modified by learning. And that's where our personal experience and cultural experience can come in. And so as promised, I want to break down the types of emotions. And this is one of those things where very few people agree on how we should break emotions down and what we should call them and whether they're consistent or not. So this is just the way that the textbook refers to it. So don't take this as the be all and end all only way to classify emotions. This is just one of them. Because of course there are tons of theories on how to do this. But our basic hierarchy of emotions starts with our universal emotions. And these are things that are seen across all cultures and show very little variation. So these are mostly just positive versus negative feelings. So we're not breaking it down into specific named emotions. Think of the universal emotions as what an infant could experience shortly after being born. They are either content because they're fed and comfortable and not moving, or they're having a negative emotion because they're hungry or they're sad or something else is going on. So it's good or bad, and those are the universal broad categories. Then we get into our basic emotions. And this is what people tend to think about when they think of emotions. But our basic emotions tend to include things like happiness and sadness, fear and disgust and anger, contempt and surprise. And we call these our basic emotions because, again, they seem to be pretty consistent between cultures. So these seem to be something that's at least partially genetically influenced. There seems to be some core factor driving these emotions, and we see them in most places, but not all. And then we get into our subtle emotions. And this is when you have, so maybe you're not happy, but maybe you're content. Or maybe you're not sad, maybe you're just melancholy, like a slight modification. So our subtle emotions are derived from our basic emotions, but they also tend to be influenced by culture. So if you have one of your parents, when they're happy, they make a particular happy sound, maybe you would start to do that because that's what you've been exposed to from a young age. And we've already kind of talked about facial expressions. These are some of the key expressive behaviors that you can exhibit. And when we talk about us being able to interpret expressive behaviors, humans are pretty good at it. Again, we're social creatures, so we're good at reading our own kind. Though our ability to judge emotion typically ends up doing better if we're doing it in context. So if you see a person in an environment, if you can see their body language and what's going on around them, you're going to be a lot more accurate at reading their facial expression. Whereas if you're just shown a picture of their face, there's going to be a little bit more room for error. For at least our basic emotions, we see a pretty good general agreement across cultures. People are pretty good at telling if someone is happy or sad, if they're angry or afraid. And interestingly, women tend to be more accurate at judging facial expressions. And maybe that's an evolutionary thing, maybe not. We can never be quite sure. But we could look at sort of, this is the standard display for a psychological evaluation of emotions. And so they'll show you a bunch of faces that are happy or disgusted or surprised. And to check if this is, say, a basic emotion, to see how much agreement we get in different cultures, you could run the exact same experiment in multiple countries and see how much agreement you get. And people tend to agree pretty well on happiness. They can find a happy person fairly easily. Something like surprise seems to go really well. But sadness and fear seem to show some pretty significant cultural differences. Having 62% agreement is not terrible. That's not, they're not completely at a loss to identify sadness, but they just have a slightly different interpretation. So we could say there's a cultural influence there. Which brings us to our next slide, where that effect of culture could fall under what are called cultural display rules. So they're kind of like our cultural norms, but more specific. So these are specific to when and how you express emotion. So one of the examples would be that, say in Japan, it's frowned upon to show lots of sadness, to be overly emotive. You're supposed to be calm and collected on the outside, especially in, say, a workplace environment. So even if you got really bad news at work, if you were in Japan, you would wait to show that sadness until, say, you got home or you could be by yourself. Whereas in North America, you'd probably be, you wouldn't be too out of place if you, say, cried at work because you got some really bad news. And so these are going to be an influence of some biological factors and our cultural factors, and it all works together to give us an individual's emotional expressions. So there's lots going on when we're looking at those expressive behaviors. And that's going to carry on into our instrumental behaviors as well. So instrumental behaviors, you could think about, say, instrumental conditioning, where you are accomplishing a task. So instrumental behaviors are specifically directed at achieving a particular goal. So your emotion can function as a call to action. It's going to drive you to do something. So you're doing an instrumental behavior because of a particular emotional response. And the example we can talk about here is the idea that emotions can actually help enhance your performance for particular tasks. If you think of an athlete before a big game, maybe they're going to psych themselves up. They're going to work up their emotions so that they can perform better during the sport. But we've done some psychological studies, and it lets us know that there's kind of a trade-off here. So if you're having sort of heightened emotions, it can help your performance for basic tasks, tasks that don't involve too much cognitive processing, but too much emotion can end up interfering with more complex tasks. And so you end up with this trade-off, and I'm actually going to show you a graph that helps illustrate this. And so if we consider, on the bottom here, we have generic level of arousal. So how happy or sad are you? How angry or how neutral are you? And then efficiency of performance is how good are you at the task? And so we're going to start with our simplest task, and that's this purple line. And our purple line shows that your ability to do the task will actually increase the more emotionally involved in the task you are. And I like to use the example of maybe I'm playing a video game and I'm just playing it. I'm not paying a lot of attention. It's fine. It's on in the background. I'm not putting a lot of effort into it. But maybe I'm not very good at it and I keep dying. But then you start getting mad that you're dying. And so you sit up straight and you hold the controller better and you're like, no, I'm going to do this. And so the angrier you get, the more attention you're paying and the more you're responding at the right time, and your performance can do better. Though you can also hit that point where if you get too involved, you get too angry, and you have to take a break because it's starting to hinder your performance. So there's sort of a point where it helps to a point, and then it starts to hinder. If we then look at our red line here, our most complex task, say you're doing some really fine detail painting. Maybe you're repairing a broken figurine and you have to put something in a very particular spot. Having a high level of emotional arousal is going to make your hands shake. It's going to make your breathing quick. Maybe you're not going to be able to focus and you're going to do a very bad job at this fine detailed task. So you would be better off having a lower level of that emotional arousal to complete a complex task that involves lots of details for it. So you have to consider how hard is the task before you determine what's the optimal level of involvement to have. And so our last couple of slides here are going to be all about theories of emotion. And so we're going to talk about our discrete emotions theory, our cognitive theories of emotion, and then some unconscious influences on emotion. And this is going to be pretty quick fire. We're not spending tons of time on each of these theories, but it's a good idea to be able to tell them apart. So our discrete emotions theory has the idea that humans experience a small number of discrete emotions. So you would have happiness, and happiness has its own box. And you have sadness, and sadness has its own box. And so you can label each emotion. And we can get some more complex emotions by combining our individual boxes. But for the most part, everything's going to have a label. And this goes back to that idea of we have distinctive, maybe genetically influenced emotions, so they're determined by genes. So we have our evidence that infants will smile during REM sleep. There's that adaptive significance of certain responses, where we should have distinct categories, and there's probably a pretty strong genetic component. So that's our sort of biological side of the evidence. On the cultural side, we can again point at stuff we've already talked about. The idea that people can recognize and generate the same emotional expression no matter what culture they're from. So that study where most people could agree that a face was happy or that a face was surprised, that would be evidence that we all have the same discrete set of emotions. Though that could be explained away because of globalization of culture. Back in the 70s, globalization of culture meant that you could see TV shows that would be aired in multiple countries, and so there was some crossover in culture. Nowadays, globalization of culture is absolutely everywhere because of the internet. And so there are phrases that are that used to be specific to one particular country that everybody recognizes now because it's on the internet. But for the most part, there do seem to be a small number of our primary or basic emotions that are going to exist across cultures. And those are our basic emotions here. And there's some new research that says maybe pride is cross-cultural and should be included with the basic emotions, but the emotional psychologists can fight about that and let us know in the future which way they go on it. We should also keep in mind that even though these emotions seem to be consistent across cultures, we can recognize happy or surprised, it doesn't mean that the cultures are going to express them the same way. And we had talked about that with our cultural display rules and the fact that you might not show that you're sad if you're in a culture where looking sad is not socially acceptable. So more stuff to keep in mind in the background. And if we wanted to get some physiological evidence, we have the ability to differentiate between some of our primary emotions, primary meaning basic emotions, physiologically. So you can look at heart rate. So your heart tends to beat faster when you have negative emotions. Your digestive system will slow down when you feel fear. But we should take that again with a grain of salt, because if you looked at a brain scan of someone and asked them to think a happy thought and asked them to think a sad thought, they both look pretty much identical. And there's no real way to tell happy and sad apart just from brain activation, which itself is interesting and kind of cool. But it tells us that there's lots of different regions involved, and it's all a lot more complex than what we'd like. So discrete emotions theory seems to hold with most of what we have, but it doesn't have to be the whole picture. So there could be other theories that kind of make sense as well. And so we're going to move into our cognitive theories of emotion. And cognitive should start us thinking about cognition and thinking and having brain involvement. So our cognitive theories say that our emotions are products of thinking, not the other way around. And they tend to group them not into sort of discrete categories, but they would say that we have as many emotions as there are different kinds of thought. So they're saying that you're not just happy or sad, you are the type of happy that you feel when you think about this particular thing that makes you feel the way you're feeling right now. And that's completely different from the kind of happy that you feel when you get to eat your favorite chocolate cake or whatever. So they don't like the idea of discrete emotions, and they focus primarily on the idea that emotions come from that cognitive appraisal, that there isn't any immediate physiological response. Though we'll look at some of the past theories. So down at the bottom here, we're going to talk about these specific ones, mostly because they're interesting and a little bit odd. So our first theory is the James Lange theory. And this is the basic idea that emotions result specifically from our interpretations of our bodily reactions to stimuli. And that's a weird one if you think it through. And I'm going to hop back and forth between this slide and the next slide because there's a cool image on the next slide that makes these two theories a little bit easier to tell apart. And so here, this James Lange theory is stating that it's that emotional, that physiological response that we decide our emotions based on. So they have the eliciting stimulus of a bear. So you see a bear, and then by this theory, your autonomic nervous system responds, and then you are going to have a conscious evaluation of what your body is feeling. So you will sort of think about yourself and you'll say, okay, well, my heart's beating faster, my legs are trembling, my breathing is faster, all of this, I must be feeling fear because of the state of my body. So the James Lange theory says that there's a stimulus, there's that autonomic or physiological response, and then you have a conscious evaluation to determine what emotion you're feeling. And yes, that is a very strange way to think about it. And there isn't a whole lot of evidence that that is even remotely close to the case. But it did get us to this next theory, which is the Cannon-Bard theory. And this is going to sound a little bit more familiar to what we know of and use today. And so this says that an emotion-provoking event will lead simultaneously to an emotional and bodily reaction. And so here you have your eliciting stimulus, and then it's going to involve some activity in your thalamus that then causes, at the same time, your autonomic response and your conscious evaluation of that emotion. So this is a little bit closer to what we've talked about so far. Though in our theory that we talked about with our diagram, there'd be some playback between our physiological responses and our cognitive appraisal and experience. But this is what the Cannon-Bard theory stuck with. So it's part of the picture and it's getting closer. So the next two are a little bit weird. So the somatic marker theory is basically saying that you use your gut reaction to gauge how you should act. So very similar to this James Lange theory of what are you feeling, what emotion is it? This is saying that you use your gut reaction to decide how you act in response. So you decide your expressive behaviors or your instrumental behaviors based on your evaluation of that physiological response. So just a slight modification from that James Lange theory. And then the last one, our two-factor theory, says that our emotions are produced specifically by an undifferentiated arousal, and then you have to decide what's causing it. So you're in a situation and you feel some kind of heightened emotion. And so you check out your environment and you decide, well, there's a bear standing there and I'm feeling worked up, so I must be feeling fear because of that bear. So there's sort of those extra steps where you have to figure out what's going on and then attribute what you're feeling to the source. So again, these theories are not very close to what we think of and have talked about so far in this lecture, which is why I bring them up towards the end. If we had to pick one, I'd say the Canon Bard is closest to what we have for today, but none of them are a really good indicator. And then for our last section, this is our unconscious influences on emotion. And so this is, if it's unconscious, it's something that you're not cognizant of, you're not aware of, it's happening automatically. And so we've talked about subliminal exposure and how subliminal stimuli, things that you are not consciously aware of, can have very slight influences on your mood. Maybe they make you feel a little bit more positive or a little bit more negative. Not a huge influence, because subliminal stimuli aren't super good at convincing you of anything, but it's a possibility. It could make us feel a little bit more positive or a little bit more negative. We also have something really cool called the mere exposure effect. And this is the idea that things that you are familiar with, things that you've been exposed to, they generate a sense of contentment. They make you feel comfortable with them, and so you like these things just because they're familiar. This is why most brand advertising exists. So you can see a commercial for Coca-Cola, and you have no idea what they're trying to sell you. You're just like, well, all it was your logo and a jingle, and that was it. Like, that doesn't make me like you anymore. But in fact, it does. Because you're familiar with the brand, you're more comfortable with it, and you end up liking them and maybe choosing to buy that product more often. So that's mere exposure. And then our last one is kind of another cool one that I just throw in at the very end, and this is the facial feedback hypothesis. And so you are more likely to feel emotions that correspond to your facial features. So if you are smiling, you are more likely to feel happy. If you are frowning, you're more likely to feel sad. And so there's some idea that the muscular feedback of those emotions telling your brain that you're smiling or frowning makes you a little bit easier to experience the emotions that correspond to that feeling. Which is kind of cool. So when they say sort of smile and maybe you'll feel better, it kind of ends up working. So there's some supporting research for this. There's some experiments that have shown that, but it's probably also going to involve some of our classical conditioning as well, where you associate smiling with feeling happy. So it's not just the muscles, there's also some learning going on there too. But an interesting way to end.